All right, so today we're going to talk about MacRuby. Who's familiar with MacRuby? Whoever played with, installed it, running it, wrote an application with it? Hey, we have 2 people, 3 people play with it. So we're going to talk about, probably should go back. I'm going to talk about Cocoa. Let's talk about Cocoa first, because MacRuby uses Cocoa, and the main objective when you use MacRuby is usually to write a Cocoa app. So let's cover Cocoa quickly. Cocoa is the Apple's objective-based programming environment for macOS X. So that's basically all the tools you have when you want to write a native app for macOS X. That means a framework, or actually a lot of frameworks, a collection of frameworks, collection of APIs, and a bunch of runtimes that you use to build your native application for Apple on the Apple OS. Cocoa uses mainly Objective-C. You can also use C to write your libraries, but usually most people end up writing a lot of code in Objective-C. So if you look at Objective-C 2.0, it's a language that's reflective, that's object-oriented, that has a garbage collection, and that has a 32 and 64-bit support. Just like that, it kind of looks like Ruby because Ruby has the same features. Ruby is reflective. It's also object-oriented. It has a garbage collection. And so Objective-C and Ruby are pretty similar in a lot of different aspects. The way you would use Ruby when you want to call a method on an object, you'd say object.method, and then you will pass a parameter. In the case of Objective-C, this is the syntax, which is not as sexy and pretty as Ruby, but it's okay. I mean, we can understand it. We have the object, and we pass the method with the parameter, and that's fine. Until we start doing stuff like that, where we want to define an array of friends. In Ruby, you do that, or you do equal array.new. And this is how you do it in Objective-C. So here we're just saying we want to have an array called friends, and that's going to be NS mutable array, and we need to allocate it, and then we need to initialize it. And it's not really, really cool. But since our goal is to write native Mac applications, we kind of have to write Objective-C, and that's not cool. So some people thought, well, we really like writing native apps for Apple. There's a lot of stuff, but we really don't like to use Objective-C that much. Why don't we write a bridge? So some guys got together and they wrote Ruby Cocoa, and I think Brian had a, is Brian here? Yeah, you actually had a presentation on Ruby Cocoa, right? Somebody did it, but so Ruby Cocoa, it's basically like, what's that? Yeah, you tried it, you didn't like it. Well, so Ruby Cocoa is just a bridge, or just. It's actually a bridge between Objective-C runtime and MRI. So you would write code in Ruby, and you can go through the bridge and access Objective-C. It's actually pretty cool, because there's no more Objective-C to write. And, you know, since Objective-C is not that sexy, we like that. You can write your app in Ruby. The problem is that it's pretty slow. So the issue here is that you have a conversion cost. So every time you have to go through the bridge, and you need to forward all the messages, and that's pretty costly. However, there are a bunch of applications that were written. Apple actually wrote some of their own application. There's a podcast producer app that uses Ruby Cocoa. There's Lime Chat, and there is another one I forgot that's pretty popular. But anyway, Ruby Cocoa is something that's being used that ships with Leopard, so you already have it on your Mac. It's pretty nice, but Apple decided they needed something better. And this is why last March in 2008, they announced MacRuby. So MacRuby is an Apple project, and it's an Apple open source project. And if you know Apple, you know they don't do a lot of open source stuff. But that's part of their open source project. You can go and get the source code. It's on Subversion and GitHub. Well, the GitHub is just a copy, but it's up to date. The big difference between Ruby CoCoa and MacRuby is that MacRuby is not a bridge. So if you remember, I was telling you the problem with the problem with Ruby CoCoa is that it's slow because it has to go through the bridge every time. So every time you have to go through Ruby to go to Objective-C and vice versa, you need to go through the bridge, and that's what's expensive. So Apple said, well, we actually don't want a bridge. Let's do it differently. And they decided to build MacRuby on top of the Objective-C runtime directly. So what that means is that you have a layer, that's the Ruby 1.9, on top of Objective-C. And now everything that you use in MacRuby are Objective-C stuff. So all classes are Objective-C classes, all methods are Objective-C methods, all objects are Objective-C objects. And the way they could do that is because they use Core Foundation, which is another open source project from Apple that defines all the data types, all the primitives like the string, the array, and stuff like that. And they are more or less the same as what we use already in Ruby. So what they do is they just put the Ruby 1.9 VM on top of the runtime, and it just talks directly one to the other. The great thing you have when you do that is first you get native threads. And if you've been dealing with threads in Ruby, you know that we only have one native thread and everything else is a green thread, and sometimes it's not really cool. Actually, quite often it's pretty sad. Objective-C has a very nice threading system. Snow Leopard is going to add even better stuff, so it's pretty exciting. Also, Objective-C has a good garbage collector. I would not say that Ruby's garbage collector is not that great, but it could be better. Objective-C has a very decent garbage collector. And thanks to that, you can do a lot of stuff. And I want to show you some code because that's why we're here, right? So I don't know if you can see. Is it big enough for everybody? Yep. So okay, when you start using MacRuby, you might think that it's totally different than what you would use when you use Ruby, but it really is exactly the same thing. So instead of doing RB to access the RB console, you would just do MacRB, something for MacRec and MacGems and all this stuff. So here we're just going to MacRB. We define friends, and we check the class of friends, and you can see that friends is not an array, a Ruby array, but it's actually an Objective-C array. Then we can say friends, and we're going to add one to the friends, and you can see the arrays being updated, and you can just add another friend, and it will work exactly the same way, the way you would expect when you use Ruby. You can even do some more complex stuff, and you will see that everything you do will just work the same way it would work with your standard Ruby MRI. But what you get on top of that is that you can do that. You can call the methods from Objective-C directly. In this case, it's not very interesting. What I do is I just take a string, and I do uppercase in Ruby, and I do the same in Objective-C. I do uppercase string. But what that means is that now we open to the entire library of frameworks for Cocoa and for Objective-C, and we can actually start building a nice application. But that also means we have full access to the Xcode environment. So I don't know if you've been using Xcode to write Ruby. I don't know a lot of people doing that, but Xcode has an IDE, and you can actually write Ruby with it. But Xcode is mainly used to write Cocoa apps. And the Xcode environment is actually pretty decent. There are a lot of tools. First thing is free. So it comes with your Mac. If you want the latest version, there's the URL, so you can download it. There's a lot of different tools. It's well documented. So you can go to developer.apple.com, and you have full documentation on the tools and the language. And it's also pretty well done. I really like, personally, Interface Builder. That's the tool you use to create the GUI. And it's very well done. The other thing you get, which is something that I really wish we had in standard Ruby, is you have profilers. So that's instruments. And you can actually profile your app, and you can see if you have any leaks. You can check the CPU usage, the memory usage, how many objects you create. You can use dtrace to see what's going on. And all of that, you get it for free when you use MacRuby. And that's actually going to be the app I'm going to show you. I wrote a quick app for the presentation, and I'm just profiling the app. And here in the object allocation, I see how many objects I create. I make sure that I don't use too much CPU and memory, and you can actually go through the entire app this way. So let's go ahead and start building an app. I will not do it. I will not do some live coding. I'll just show you a few steps to show you how easy it is to write a MacRuby app. First thing, when you install MacRuby, which by the way is just doing, or you download the latest version, or you download the source code and you do rec and sudo rec install. That's it. So it's pretty easy. Once you have MacRuby installed, you have a new template, and you can say, okay, I want to develop a MacRuby application. And you have another template for core data. Core data is the database or the storage system for Cocoa. Not going to cover that today, but you can use that in your MacRuby apps. So once you create the app, everything is already set up for you. You have the default template. The MacRuby framework is already loaded. So MacRuby is just one simple framework. And a framework is just all the libraries together. So you can actually ship your application with the framework in it directly. People don't need to have MacRuby installed when you deploy your application or when you give it away to people when you sell your application. So MacRuby framework is available. Then you get an rb_main.rb, which is, I'm going to show you that in a second. It's just the files you need, and it's just pure Ruby. So we load the framework Cocoa, and then we go and we get all the Ruby files available in the project, and we just load them in the path. So we just get the path, and then we require the files, and then we start the Cocoa app. You usually never change that unless you need to add a new framework. So if you want to use, let's say, WebKit or something else, you can define that here. The other file that's important for us is the main menu.nib. So the nib file is just, the nib files in Cocoa are all the different GUI elements you have. So you can have different windows, and that's how you're going to define that. You're going to define them. You can double click on the main nib, and it's going to open it in Interface Builder. And you see that the main nib has different objects, different windows. So we have a main window, and then we have a menu. And you can go and edit stuff. Here, for the example, I just added a table view, which is like a grid. And I added an add button. What I want to do is I want to be able to list all my friends and to add new friends. So that's the goal of the application. So the nib files are kind of the V of the MVC. They are the views in your application. Then we're going to prepare the binding. So you go through, we open the table view, and we go into the table column, and we say for each column, if you go back here, we can see what we want is to have a first name column and a last name column. So here, we're just going to define the title and the identifier so we can do some binding. Then we go for the C of MVC. We want to add a controller that would manage the interaction between the view and the model. So we create a new file called control.rb or whatever you want. Control.rb makes kind of sense, but whatever. In control.rb, we just define a normal Ruby class. We add an attribute writer. And we have a bunch of methods that I added that we'll explain quickly. But let's start by this attribute writer. The attribute writer in Ruby, just in case you don't know, will set a variable, an instance variable that will be at friends table view, and you have a method to access it and a method to write to it. So it's what we call an instance variable, and in the Cocoa jargon they call that an outlet. At least in the interface builder they call that an outlet. The second thing we want is a method called awake from nib, and that's just part of what the nibs need. When the nib gets instantialized and gets loaded, it will call the controller, and we're going to create this binding, and then it will call this method awake from nib. It's like kind of initialize in Ruby, if you want, when you start a class. it does the same thing, but once the outlet is set properly and the connection is set, it will call awake from Nib, and it will do different things. And here what we do when the Nib is loaded is we create a new array for friends, and then we set the data source for the table view as self. So you kind of need to know a bit about Cocoa and to understand how it works. But table view is this big grid I showed you, and to feed a table view, you need to send a data source. So you need to have like a hash or an array or whatever type of data source to feed it so you can actually display all this information. And in this case, what we do is we just say, take it from the controller. Then what we do is we add another method called addFriend, and that's the method that we're going to call when you press the add button. Here again, we need to do some Cocoa stuff. We just need to mention the standard, and I explain that later on. But we have this new method called addFriend. And here we create the binding between our controller and the Nibs. So these are two different screens. But what we do is we set the controller and we link it to friends table view, and automatically you will get access to the class variable. All the information that you had in your controller are now available in Interface Builder. So we just say, okay, controller needs to connect to the table view, and when you push the button, we want to call the method addFriend, and that's what's being done here. So it's pretty straightforward. The first time you do it, you might have to go through the documentation to see what's going on, but it's just simple binding. Now let's talk about the Nstable data source. So because we use this complex UI interface, which I have somewhere here, we want to use a grid, and that's a bit more complicated. The table view is not as simple as a simple field. So we need to feed it information in a certain way, and the table view has an informal protocol. What that means is that there are a bunch of methods that are not required, but if you use them, you will be able to do more things. And there are some that actually are needed if you want to feed the table view. So the first thing we need is a method called number of rows in table view, and we need to pass the view, and that will let the table view know how many items we have in the table view. Then we need to define another method called table view, and we're going to pass some different information. And you can see that the method signature is a bit strange. We usually don't do that in Ruby. Here we have view, object value for table column, column, row index. In Objective-C, they call that a selector, and they are part of the method signature, and they are actually required. So you need to actually pass them. And you can have two methods called table view, but they will have a different signature because the selectors will be different. And in this case, that's exactly what we do. Here you can see we have object value for table column. And then the second method, which is also table view, is set object value. So the method signature is different because of the selectors. What's important to know when you write Ruby is that you will need to pass these attributes. They're actually required. And you can just pass them like that, and I'll show you an example, or you can just pass it as a hash. So you can say table view, and then like @view, comma, and then you can say, you can have a hash that has a key object value for table column, and the value for the key will be the column itself. I'll just show you. It's very straightforward, but at first, when you're not used to Objective-C, it's a bit strange to have two methods with different selectors, but that's what we need to have. Once we're done, we just press build and go, and that will build the app. And I guess I do not have a screenshot. That's surprising. I can show it to you at the end. I will basically just create the grid, and you will see the interface, and you can use it. So the problem is some of us don't really like using Xcode. When I need to write a simple app, I don't really want to deal with Nibs and set up the bindings and stuff like that. I wish I could just write everything programmatically and just write the code I need. And this is why Rich Kilmer decided to write some helpers, so kind of a framework on top of the framework called HotCocoa. What HotCocoa does is that it gives you the ability to write your app in pure Ruby. So no more Xcode. You just get a nice DSL for Cocoa. So remember, we're still writing Objective-C, but Cocoa is the way you will build your interface and how you will deal with these different elements. So when you install MacRuby, you actually get HotCocoa directly, and you can start building your first HotCocoa project. You just do HotCocoa SDRuby, and that would generate a project for you. And that's what you get in your project. You get a config folder, a lib folder, and a resources folder. So in the config folder, you get a build.yaml file. Actually, I could just show it to you. Let's do it. Let's do it live. All right, so I'll do HotCocoa, and I already have an SDRuby project. So SDRuby2. I'm not on the good screen. All right, that would probably help. And I guess you will not see because it's not big enough. Oh, and you can see all the stuff I did before. All right, so HotCocoa SDRuby2, and that just creates the project. And if I open it, so you can believe me, there you go. I get all my project that you don't need to see. Where's my shell? So cd SDRuby2, and we open the files. So there you go. We have all the files. I can show you that we have this build.yaml that's opening in Aptana. Why is that opening in Aptana? Do not use Aptana. No, I mean, let's open it with TextMate. There you go, much better. So that's your config file with the name of the application, where to get the files. Pretty straightforward. Let's go back to the slide show, if it's still here. Yes. So we get this build.yaml. Then we get a lib with application.rb. We're going to look in details. Then you have another file for the menu. That's for the main menu, so you can define what's going on in the menu. Then you have a rec file that will help us build the application. You can have your own custom rec task if you want. And then we have a folder with the resources. And the only resource we have to start with is just an icon. And that's the icon you're going to use when you will build the app. You can, of course, use your own. When you install the development tools, you have a resource that's called, it's not called icon builder, but something like that. You can just dump a picture and it will create the icon for you. So let's look at application.rb. Application.rb just does that. It does, well, there's a bit of code above and below, but it does a start on the class called application, or yes, called application. And you have a method called class, and it does a bunch of stuff. And let's just quickly look through it. The first line, it's application name, SDRuby do app, and then it's a block. What that is, it's HotCocoa just having a binding or a mapping to NS application. So here you have your method called application, and it will take different attributes. And these are the selectors. And HotCocoa knows that there are some selectors that you need to pass, and they are always the same, and they're just hidden, and you can override them, but by default they're going to be set up for you. So you just say application name SDRuby do, and now we just have an application that's being built. Inside the NS application, we can do different things. But before we do that, we need to set the delegation. The delegation is when something happens in the application, a callback will be sent. So when the application calls SDRuby, somebody will click on a button, or when we will close the application, we need to set the delegation. So the message will be sent to something. And here we just say, when something happens to the application, delegate the message to myself, which is the application, the class we're on. After we're done with that, let me show you the delegation. So here's the delegation. So when you open the menu, when there's a new menu item, or when you click on help, when you zoom, all of that are just delegation that are set. And you can put your code in this method that are just empty right now. And you can do whatever you want with these delegations. Inside the application, we add a window. So it's the same thing. There's NS window in Cocoa, and here just take a window and pass different. You will pass different attributes and say the window is a frame that starts at pixel x100 and y100, and it has a width of 500 and height of 500, and the title will be SDRuby, and then we have another block. Inside this block, we just add a new label. A label is just an text field, but NS text field a lot of different. You can use text field to do a lot of things. And label is a special helper that already has some of the settings. So, for instance, you cannot edit this text field, so that's why it's a label. And all of that is done directly for you in HotCocoa. So you say label. This is the text for my label. And I will define the layout to not start at the beginning. Start false is something from HotCocoa. By default, everything starts from the bottom. So if you add a new element, it will go at the bottom. In this case, it will just go at the top. So that's why we say start false. And then in the window, we add the label, because until now, we just created the instance of the label, but we need to add it. So we just add it to the window, which I basically rewrote the code twice. So just say win. And then we add another delegation. We say when the window is closed, then call the method called exit. And you could do win, will close, do, and then you can pass the block. You can do stuff in the block if you want to. Now, if you now go back to the console, and actually I can do that. I can show you when you type MacRec. It will just build the app. So if we go back to our shell, where's the shell? There, no. All right. So if I type MacRec, it will start MacRec, and you will not see it because it's on the other screen. But it builds the app for us, and it will start it. It's starting on the other side. So let me just bring it over. There you go. And so you have an app. A .app folder that's being created, and we have our normal native app that's here with the label that we added to the window. I can close it, and we have a menu, and the menu is just coming from the file, and I can quit it, and I can show you on the file system. There we have our SDRuby 2, and I can even show you what's inside our app. So we have our frameworks, and in the frameworks, we don't have anything right now because we didn't compile it with the framework. And then we have our code. Everything is here. In the lib, we can see we have our source code in Ruby. So everything is here. That's great, but we will not go very far with that. So let's look at something a bit more interesting. When you use MacRuby, you have a lot of Cocoa frameworks. And you can reuse a lot of the code that's written in Objective-C or C and just leverage all of that. For instance, WebKit. WebKit is what's being used by Safari to browse the web. And what you can do in MacRuby is just this, framework WebKit. When you do that, you have WebKit loaded into your app. And then you can just add a web view being just a WebKit instance. It's not really a WebKit instance, but it's just a browser aspect of it. So in the window, like we saw before, you can just say add to the window, web view, and we define the layout to just expand to whatever room we have, and we will give it a URL to sdruby.com. If you do that in the same app as the one we wrote, that will give you that. You get a normal browser. You can go and click. It's just a normal browser that's built in. What's very interesting with that is that a WebKit has a lot of hooks, so you can communicate between your app and WebKit. You can also call JavaScript back and forth. So you could use something like jQuery to do some of the stuff on the page. And from Objective-C or from MacRuby, you would call it, and you say, OK, do something on the page. Or when jQuery does something, it could actually send you a message back. So you could have a nice bridging between the browser and between MacRuby. So you can see how you will be able to reuse some of your code to do some fancy client application. The next thing we could do, now we're done with the application, we could just do macrec deploy. And if you do that, it will just build the app the same way it would do with MacRec, but it will also bundle the framework. So you can see here, I have MacRuby.framework, and I have the bridge support. So all of that is just built in, and you can ship this application. So you can give your .app, you can create a package for it, like a PKG or DMG, and send it to your friends, and they can just run it. They don't need to install anything. You can do that and much more. So let me just show you some examples of apps that were written. So let's see some of the demo app we have. What do we have? HotCocoa. Oh, you can use dtrace. I'm not going to show you that today, but let's go to, what do we have here? Do we have the Flickr app? That's not me. It's the wrong tab. Sample, yeah. Let's go to the Flickr app, and let's actually build it. So, building it, and I do not see it. Okay, maybe it's not a good example. Let's go to something I tested before. We have a demo app. Where's the demo? Just give me 1 second. I'll bring that back here so I can see what's going on. All right. So I'm opening the app. Hopefully you will see it. Okay, here's the app that Rich wrote for RubyConf, just to show you all the different things you can do. First thing is we can see here in real time when I drop the window, the position of the window. So the X and the Y will change. You can note all the different buttons the same way you would do it. So you have normal buttons, and here is an alert. And seek a square. So you have all the normal stuff. You can also create a collection view, which is just a bunch of images. So you loaded an image and put it into a collection view. You have all the other controls that exist. So you can have text fields. You have the combo boxes. Another type that would change all the other ones. You can have secret, like for a password. You can also play movies using QuickTimes. That's the table. So you can say COM2. This one is not implemented, so you can actually you cannot edit it, but it's the same concept than Nstable. You have the web view, and that will load. I'm not an intranet, but you could type the URL and go here, and then you have WebKit access. It didn't put any menu, but it's normal. You have access to all the normal Cocoa stuff. Let me show you what I did as a test. So I wrote a quick app based on the raffle gem. So we have a raffle for SD Ruby where we pick a winner every time, and I'm like, oh, that would be nice if we had a nice interface for that. So I ported that, and I'm going to open it right now. Open S. So, no, that's not the right one. Alright, so we're opening SD Ruby. So what you don't see is that we use a nice icon. But okay, so what I did here, I just put the SD Ruby logo. Here I loaded some text. And what we would do, we would enter the first name. So let's put Patrick. Crowley, and we could just click on add, and that would just add it here to my table. If I misspelled his name, I could come here and say Crowley. Well, actually, no, it's really Crowley. So I could add all the different participants. Then I could say, okay, go ahead and pick a winner.
And the winner is...
What was the winner?
And the winner is Matt.
Yeah, that's better. So, so here I just also use something else. I went and I say, okay, use the speech synthesizer or whatever it's called, so you can actually have some sound. It's a normal Ruby code, and it's just using the gem in the background. And when there's no more winners,
everyone already won.
So I just what we can. I also added a simple button that does about, and here it will load as the Ruby. So we have the web page that's being loaded, and we can navigate, and we could go and say, okay, let's visit the sponsor. Let's go watch a pip code. And I do not have internet, so it's not going to work, but everything works fine. It's pretty nice. It was pretty easy to do. I can show you the code if you're interested. It's just basically creating some helpers and dumping them. It's pure Ruby, so it's pretty fun. I also have, I play with the menu, so you can see.
Welcome to HD Ruby Raffle application written by Matt Aimonetti.
So it's it's some tiny stuff, but it's always fun to play with. And all of that's just being written in Ruby, so there's no need to know too much about Cocoa. You still need to understand, you still need to know the API, but everything else is just pure Ruby. So let me close it and go back to here, press play. So this was the demo app. So that was pretty nice, pretty easy to do. You need to understand how things work, but once you understand, it will take you a few minutes to write a simple interface. So what do you do with MacRuby? Well, the answer for me is that you can write web app client. I spend most of my time writing web apps. And the browser is good, but it's sometimes very frustrating. And being able to write a nice client where you're not limited by the HTML and CSS and the browser that's being used and stuff like that is actually pretty nice. Also, it adds more value when people, in some instances, not all the time, but in some instances, for instance, you have an admin backend. If you deliver an application and you give the admin backend as a desktop app, some clients might actually like that. You might also be able to interact with the system itself. So if you need to access some files, if you need to use FTP to transfer files, if you need to use proper drag and drop, if you need to do all this stuff, you can use MacRuby to do that. What's also really nice is that you can reuse your Ruby code, because if you have a class, you can just reuse it. I would probably suggest you wrap it into a gem, and then in your Ruby code, you just require the gem. And then when you distribute your application, you can package the gem. So reusing the code. You can also rethink your desktop apps. We've been using desktop apps for a while, and we've been using them in a way. But now that we have a lot of new technology, I think we have to rethink the way we write these desktop apps. When does it make sense to write desktop app, and why? Something that I've been playing with, for instance, is you could imagine having a MacRuby app, so a Cocoa app, that uses MERB core to connect and to serve different data. And now you have a peer-to-peer network of a lot of different applications working together, connecting to each other and serving different type of data. You could write video games this way. You have access to all the native OpenGL stuff. So you can write games and interact with your own app. You could also use something like Couchdb. Couchdb uses the web, HTTP, to connect. So you could have a connection, authenticated connection to Couchdb and use it as a backend. You could even ship Couchdb with your MacRuby app and have your own database, and then you just replicate over the web. So now you have offline and online, and you don't have to go and access the server all the time. There's a lot of things we can do, and I think we're just starting to understand that desktop apps really are not the thing that most people develop anymore, but there's a market for these desktop apps, and we need to see what this market is. And I think that MacRuby really would be great for that. The other thing is WebKit integration. We looked at that a little bit, but for instance, a very good example of WebKit being used is the Wikipedia iPhone app. Wikipedia bought one of the top wiki apps for the iPhone, and now it's open source and it's written in MIRB. And the iPhone client app is very simple. It's a normal iPhone little app that loads WebKit, and there's interaction with WebKit, and WebKit talks directly to, loads the page directly from a special server at Wikipedia, and then there's transfer of data, and then you can add more interaction between WebKit and the client. So it's something very interesting you can do that. But what's the future of MacRuby? So there is a lot of very exciting news. I'm a good friend with the lead developer of MacRuby called Laurent Sansonetti, working at Apple, and he gave me some information about what's coming up. So if you go to the MacRuby website right now and you download the stable version, you'll get 0.3, which is actually pretty old. Most people use Trunk, which is 0.4, but there are still some bugs. 0.4 should be released in the next few weeks. It's pretty good, but there's much better. There's 0.5 that's going to come. I think the plan is to have something released by RubyConf, to have a final version by RubyConf. So that's in a few months. But the main thing is that it's going to have much better performance. So even though MacRuby is way faster than, what's the other one? RubyCocoa, it's still a bit slow sometimes when you need to send messages from the VM to the runtime. There are a few things that are not super fast, not as fast as a native app that's written in pure Objective-C. And the objective for 0.5 is to have the same performance on MacRuby than what you have with pure Objective-C. So you will actually not see the difference if you write your app as a pure Objective-C app or if you write it in MacRuby. And the way to do that is basically implementing a new VM. So they're rewriting all the foundations, and they've started already, and they already got something working. So they have this new VM that will come, still using the core foundation, the runtime for Objective-C, and all of that. But the VM will not be YARV, so it will not be Ruby 1.9 VM. It will be their own VM that they write to be more optimized. The idea, I think, is that Apple is trying to get more people writing apps, and they realize that there's a bunch of Ruby guys that wrote apps for the iPhone, and we're not really used to dealing with garbage collectors. If you write an iPhone app, you don't have a garbage collector. So that means you need to take care of the memory yourself, and that's why if you have an iPhone, often you will see an app and you will use it, and then it will just crash. You don't know why. The reason is the iPhone will limit the amount of memory you can use, and if you go over that, it will just kick you out. So anyway, I think Apple saw a lot of potential in all these Ruby guys. Most of us have Apple. We all use Macs. We love Macs, but we don't really write any Mac apps. And there's not a lot of people writing Objective-C. It's kind of painful. And I think that their goal, and I don't work for Apple, so I cannot say, but I think their goal is to make MacRuby an official way of writing a very nice app. The other thing is that's coming up in 0.5 is the source obfuscation. So a problem that you have right now with MacRuby is, let's say you write this super cool app, you're going to bundle it and you're going to sell it, but now people can just go open the .app file and go and see all the source files. And that's not really cool. It's really hard to sell an application that people can see all the sources. People will steal the code pretty quickly. So 0.5 will let you do that. And the way they do that is because the new VM will let you do compiled code. So they will do pre-compiling, and they will use some of the techniques that are known to encrypt the data. So you'll be able to sell your application without having people reading the source. The advantage also of having compiled code is that you can pre-optimize it before you run it instead of doing that at runtime. The other thing is they're going to do a lot of optimization based on the underlying OS. So as you know, Snow Leopard, which is the new version of macOS 10, is coming up soon. I don't know when, but probably this year. And Snow Leopard has a lot of really cool stuff, a lot of technical stuff. For instance, they use what they call Grand Central to share the multi-cores, and the threading system is better. There's a lot of really cool stuff, and they are really optimizing MacRuby for that. So that's another reason why they probably need a new VM. So as I said, I think that MacRuby will become a solid and supported way to write Cocoa apps. The fact that Apple actually invests money in writing tools for people to write application in Ruby makes me believe that that's the future. That's where they want to go. I think that it's going to be the way, or at least a very strong way, where Apple will say, okay, if you want to write cool apps, use MacRuby. Will it be the mainstream way? I don't know. I think there's a lot of potential. I think you could still use Xcode. You could do a lot of stuff. You could write only scripts. It's really quick to do. It's a very nice, Ruby is a very nice language, so it's really cool. I also believe that one day we're going to have a way of outputting some iPhone apps, so you'll be able to compile an iPhone app. The problem that they have right now is, as I said, the iPhone doesn't have a garbage collector, and MacRuby uses the garbage collector from Objective-C too, so that's not possible. So maybe one day they will be able to compile the iPhone compatible apps. Anyway, if you want more information on MacRuby, you have macruby.org. There's a very nice tutorial on the Apple dev website. I put a tiny URL link here. A bunch of tutorials. There's also a very well-known book for Cocoa. So if you want to learn Cocoa itself, there's a book, I think it's called Learning Cocoa, 3rd edition or something like that, from Hilgas. And somebody actually took all the source code that was written for the book and converted it to MacRuby. So you have chapter by chapter. You can see the code in Objective-C and the code in MacRuby. So that's the last link. Finally, I just want to recognize that all the work was done by Rich Kilmer and Laurence Aimonetti. So if you have any question, they have, I think there's a MacRuby mailing list, and there's, I think it's the same list for HotCocoa. But Rich mainly maintains HotCocoa, and Laurent just supervises everything at Apple and write all the codes. So, any questions? Questions? Yes.
I played around with MacRuby a while ago.
Right.
But I kind of, through my experience, was that I didn't know enough Cocoa to use MacRuby, so it seemed like I should just be using Cocoa anyway. I mean, I was writing Ruby code, but I really had to know what the Cocoa
API is.
API was for that. It wasn't until I saw the HotCocoa demonstration that it really blew my mind.
Yeah.
That was what a Ruby Mac app should look like when it's written.
Yeah, you're totally right. You need to know the Cocoa. If you write pure MacRuby code, you need to know the Cocoa API. You need to understand how it works. It doesn't mean you have to write Objective-C. Basically, what it means is you write Cocoa app using Cocoa API for writing in Ruby. HotCocoa is the interface, but you still need to know the API for HotCocoa. You need to know that you can do application, and then you can have something. But I agree. There's a lot of mapping. I didn't show you, but if I open TextMate, I guess oh, it's here. If you look at the HotCocoa source code, can I zoom in? No, I cannot zoom in. If you don't know the source code for MacRuby, you have HotCocoa, and inside HotCocoa you have a bunch of mappings, and here are all the mappings that are used, so to give you all the helpers, and you can actually define your own, and you can submit them as patches. Let me just pick one, for instance, I don't know, movie. So here you can see what that does. So the mapping is pretty simple. Do not want to check for errors. So we do a mapping, and we map movie to Qt movie, and this is the framework you need to do that. And and when you do the allocation, by default, it will set some defaults. Same thing for the menus and some menus. So all of that is done. It's actually very simple. Once you start knowing and understanding how Cocoa works, you can create your own mappings. And if you don't understand HotCocoa, it's also very simple to go to the source code and say, oh, okay, so a menu is just an instance of NS menu. Okay, so you go to the documentation and you find it. But I agree, if you do not know Cocoa, you can just write Ruby. And it's pretty fast. My guess is that because Objective-C is fast, the runtime is much faster than what we have right now. Just using MacRuby with HotCocoa will be way faster than using 1.9. But that's just a wild guess. There's something else I didn't talk about is Core Foundation that's being used by MacRuby is an open source, and it can be compiled on different platforms. So MacRuby right now only works on OS 10, but there is no reason why it could not be compiled to work on Linux and maybe Windows with Cygwin or something like that. But at least on Solaris and stuff like that. Yes. 1.9, which 1.9 doesn't even pass is on. Yeah. No, the current one uses. So the current 04 uses the VM from 1.9 already. Yes. The runtime is Objective-C, but the VM is 1.9. Any questions? Yes.
Let's say you're mentioning writing maybe your app inside of your application in MacRuby or HotCocoa. What is what would you think would be the best way to do that? Some sort of, you want to call a web service, or you want to call like a RESTful interface,
right,
or your app or something, pull it down in JSON. What's kind of the idea that you would?
So what I would do is I would use XML or JSON. XML is probably better in the case of Objective-C, where you have a lot of different frameworks that are optimized. I personally rewrote the JSON interface on MacRuby. That's why I suggest you don't use it. No, it works, but it's the way Ruby does JSON is a bit tricky. So it's not the official way. JSON has been defined as a protocol, and the JSON Ruby gem has a tendency to do a lot of stuff that might not be supported in other ports. So you can do the same thing. JSON works fine depending on your application, but in other cases you might want to use XML. But that's just the file format. If you use Rails, you can use something like Active Resource, I think it's called. Is it Active Resource? Yeah, Active Resource, where you have the interface so you can call and reuse your models. Anything else, you can just use a normal API. It's very, very simple to just get the data. What I didn't show to you is, if you remember the grid at first, so the grid just needs to have a data source, and the data source is like a hash, okay? And then once something is being modified, you just redraw the grid. So what you can do is you can go and pull the data, and you just say redraw, and then it will just use the object itself. So it's pretty simple. It would be the same for desktop app. You can just have like a timer, the same way you would do it in JavaScript or whatever, and say pull the data, and then reload and redraw. Or if there is interaction with the user and the user press redraw, then it will just do it itself. So when you add something. What's nice is now you can also offer offline stuff that you can already do with a normal web app. If you use WebKit or if you use Firefox, something like that, you can use, what is it called, Gears or whatever, Google Gears. But anyway, it really depends on the project. I don't think you should write a MacRuby app for every single thing you do. I just think it's great that now we finally have a bunch of tools, and MacRuby not being the only one, that you can use to write some small desktop apps. Yes?
Is there any way for to use MacRuby that we can use the add-on frameworks for Cocoa?
Yeah, absolutely. So the example I wanted to show you that doesn't work. It uses the Flickr framework. So somebody wrote a Flickr framework, so where you have the full interface. You can just download it, you package it into your application, and it works. The example of WebKit is we use the WebKit framework. So you can use whatever framework, whatever library it's available. In the case of the JSON gem that I wrote for MacRuby, what I did is I took a library that was written for Objective-C, I modified it, and I wrote a dynamic library, and I just package it, and you require it inside your Ruby code, and then it works. The nice thing is now you can just require Objective-C code inside your Ruby code, and it works fine. Yeah. Yeah, iPhone on Rails.com, and what it is, it's a client for the iPhone using Objective-C that can go and query and deal with all the connection with Active Resource, which is pretty nice. So yeah, you can totally do that. You can just load the framework or load the library and use it in the code, because everything you do is basically Objective-C. Even though the DSL is Ruby, the underlying runtime will be Objective-C. Any more questions? Yes. A Java file in there. So you would like.
So you were saying you can require an Active-C library?
Yes. So we'd like to mix MacRuby and JRuby. I don't think so. If you can do it in Objective-C, yes, I guess you can, but I really don't think it's not the same VM, and no. You cannot do that in Ruby. In Ruby, you cannot require a Java file either. You need to use JRuby, which uses the virtual machine, the JVM. So in this case, no, you cannot do that. What you can do is you can work with another file, and you can, have messages the same way you would do it in normal Objective-C app. But I do not understand why you would want to do that. Okay. That's it? All right.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.